We're talking about this because this is sort of a great sort of way to set the tone for how we talk about Bruichladdich. Both Westland and Bruichladdich make single malt. They both make single malt in a very sort of values-led style, like looking at what's around them, pulling from what's local. The whole idea of kind of what grows together goes together. This idea of terroir, which we talk about a lot with wine, but really is a sense of provenance, that the people, the place, the agriculture, everything comes together to create this product that is a reflection of the culture of that area. So starting with Seattle, the Pacific Northwest, this is kind of the final frontier, if you will, in American exploration. As the settlers came on the East Coast, they pushed west. Our sort of saying for Westland is our West is whiskey. And American single malt is, in our mind, the next sort of innovation, right? Exploration of the American whiskey category. So what you have in front of you is our flagship. This is our house style. Everything we're doing at Westland is built in the back of this flavor profile. Now, what makes this different than Scotch whiskey is probably easier to list than what makes it similar. It's all barley based. There's the same rules in Scotland as there are now in American single malt, which we can get to in a minute. What makes this different are essentially three things. First of all, you can tell by the color. Either that's a lot of time in wood or that's fresh wood. What this is fresh wood. American single malt, the idea that American whiskey should have a lot of that kind of toffee, vanilla, caramel nose, similar to a bourbon. So new oak. Now, what makes this oak unique, it makes it very inefficient and difficult to work with, and you're going to find that's sort of an ongoing theme between these two distilleries. Very qualitative as opposed to quantitative. We're much more into exploring flavor than, say, putting out mass amounts of product. The oak that goes into this is all air dried. These are essentially wine quality wood. Now, not to get too nerdy, it's actually easier to get nerdy at the beginning of the seminar as it is, like, say, later on down the road. You know. You're heckling me in Chicago after a few drinks. We'll see how the night goes. Well, the oak that we use for this whiskey is air dried as opposed to kiln dried. Now, when you're making bourbon's a very sweet distillate, right? When you're preparing the wood to make a bourbon cask, you need to dry it. You can dry it in a kiln, which takes 18 to 24 hours roughly. But what that does is the kiln is it cooks off the wood sugar and concentrates tannin. So tannin in wine, tannin in tea, it's a bittering agent. It creates that balance between the sweet distillate and the bitterness in the oak. That's a good thing for bourbon. Tannin does not do well with single malt. It will dominate your spirit, which is why in Scotland they're using refilled American oak, which just had that tannin already extracted by the bourbon. Plus they have that huge secondary market. So our first challenge is, how do we get that new American oak nose, toffee, vanilla, caramel, without overpowering the barley-based distillate with tannin? The answer is air dried as opposed to kiln dried. So air dried is what you would call wine quality wood. It does not have the tannin because this board, when the board is harvested and left outside, it's rained on, it's dried out, rained on, dried out over and over again, and it leaches the tannins out of the wood. You'll see the ground beneath stained red with tannin. What that does is concentrate wood sugar. So instead of 18 to 24 hours, what we're dealing with is two different types of oak in this, our Cooper Select and our Cooper's Reserve, 18-month and a 24-month air-dried oak. So you will get that wood sugar, you won't get the tannin, but you'll get that big kind of that classic American style nose, toffee, vanilla, caramel, white American, Quercus alba American oak. We're very much into, again, the quality of the raw ingredients and building a fantastic whiskey on that. So we're not using commodity barley, we're not using any barley that's bred for yield, but barley bred for flavor. And the longer whiskey sits in the cask, the more it tastes like the casks. The younger the whiskey is, the more it speaks to the barley. So if you're using cheap commodity barley, not bred for flavor, but bred for yield, then you go young, your cheap barley, it tastes like cheap whiskey, basically. And that's where that burn comes from. So at that point, you need to throw it in a cask for extended periods of time to kind of barrel that hot, kind of edgy ethanol out. So for us, though, we want to be able to celebrate that raw ingredient and actually showcase that, but find that sort of balance between the youth of the whiskey and then the impact of the casks.
But if you go to
offers what we call the outpost range, because every exploration, the fringes of the frontier, you have your outposts, right? The furthest sort of explored regions. So the three outposts we're exploring here are Polare, which is our barley-focused whiskey. Polare is Latin cultivate. to cultivate. That's our sort of single variety, single estate style. What we're opening now is called Gariana, which focuses on a type of oak that only grows in the Pacific Northwest. So typical white American oak is called Quercus alba. That's what we were having before in the bourbon casks, in our typical barrels. This is Quercus Gariana, which grows from, say, southern British Columbia to northern California.
Do you know which one is it in the list?
This is Gariana 9. Also not on the list.
Also not on the list.
But the Gariana 4 and 5 are there, which you can stick them together, make Gary 9.
Yeah, but that makes it cool.
Yeah.
Gariana.
So Gariana is a yearly release. Gary oak, this type of oak, is protected. There's about 15% of its original growing region left. It's a $10,000 fine if you're caught cutting down a tree. We literally put out wanted signs for landowners after storms. If you own land with Gary trees on it, there's a blowdown, we'll take it. Now, these casks are very rare, but luckily, we haven't found the point of neutrality yet on it, meaning we can reuse them over and over again, and it doesn't lose the flavor, it doesn't lose the impact. The flavor that comes out of this is incredible. Now, remember I said before, you have your 18 to 24 months to air dry. Gary oak is 3 to 5 years. It takes a considerable longer amount of time to dry it out. Tighter grain to it in the actual wood, the grain of the wood. But you get this like meaty kind of molasses, kind of stewed fruit element to it. It is very similar to like to sherry cask, which this one does have some Oloroso in it, some bourbon barrels, but then the majority of it is the Gary oak, which has a lot of flavor, a lot of color to it very quickly. But I mean, to me, Gary oak is like blueberry, like a blueberry jam, like a blueberry compote. Maple syrup, barbecue, bacon, very meaty, but very sweet at the same time.
So this is Bruichladdich answer to the tariffs.
Well, this is
Because you can't get a good whiskey for
It is true.
$69.
This is Bruichladdich sister distillery.
Yeah.
Home of the same, which is a very difficult to pronounce word. I've talked to people that have been drinking whiskey their whole lives, that they still call it Island. It's not Rhode Island, it's Rhode Island. It's just Island without the N. And it's Bruichladdich, Brook like a stream, Lottie like a little kid. And that's probably the hardest thing to pronounce out of all this tonight. But Isla's a small island, about 3,500 people, about 35,000 sheep. 9 very famous whiskey distilleries. Very well known for heavily peated whiskeys, like we were discussing, like you were saying, like things like Ardbeg, Bowmore, Lagavulin, Lefroy, Bunahab. These are all established whiskey distilleries on the island. And what makes Bruichladdich different, aside from that blue bottle, is Bruichladdich was built in 1881 as the first commercial distillery built on the island. And you can read that as the first legal distillery built on the island. But it was made to make whiskey for blends. Blended whiskey was taking off at the time. And you use a very small amount of Islay peated whiskey to make blended whiskeys like Johnny Walker or Chivas, Dewar's. Those were all the big ones at the time. But what the Harvey brothers, the guys that started this, what they found was that we can do a peated whiskey, but we can make it light, floral, elegant, and have it make more of the percentage of that blended whiskey. So you sell more. But it was all cutting edge tech at the time. For Victorian age, it was the first distillery on Islay to use concrete, to actually have different buildings for different sort of production. So if you had a fire, you didn't lose everything. They actually built it into a hill to use gravity to move the wash to the stills. Bruichladdich means a gentle slope by the sea. And over the years, you had a couple of world wars, Prohibition, Great Depression, Irish Revolution. It made it very difficult to kind of maintain a consistent business. So Bruichladdich opened and closed, was mothballed 4 times. Now the benefit of that, though, for us, is that it never modernized beyond that cutting-edge Victorian age tech. It never got computers, never kind of went the factory distillation route that the rest of the industry has gone. So it was reopened in 2001 by 2 wine merchants that found these old Bruichladdich that, to them, they thought these had structure, they had balance. They weren't that big kind of peat punch in the face. These are whiskeys that we can bring to wine drinkers that appreciate that kind of balance and like elegance and structure in their liquid, their beverage alcohol. So they became obsessed with reopening the distillery. It was in 2001 that we did reopen. They basically took everything apart, put it back together again with the original tech. So this is whiskey, despite a very modern package. It's not your granddad's whiskey for sure. It's made the old-fashioned way. It's made by sight, by smell, by taste, and by hand. And the industry is going to done an awful lot of work to kind of go the opposite way, to make the packaging look as authentic and old-fashioned as possible, but the whiskey's made by some guy in an iPad. This sort of Starship Enterprise setup. If you go to a distillery, you'll see a bank of computers that makes the same whiskey day in and day out. And that is a great way to put out a consistent product, at a lower price point. Your supply chain, you age everything together, so it makes it easier to get it out there, but that's just not the way that we want to do things. As I said before, we are not an efficient distillery. But I guarantee you, after all the whiskeys you're tasting tonight, no one's going to nose one of these whiskeys and say, man, that smells efficient, right? It's just not a thing. It's all about the flavor. So, Bruichladdich, when we reopened in 2001, wanted to do things in a different way. You had, for the most part, whiskey aged in American oak, and you had sherry barrels. So we couldn't afford sherry barrels. So our thought was, well, what are wine casks if not, what are sherry barrels if not wine casks? So let's set about and use these networks we have to bring in a bunch of wine casks. So now we have well over 20 warehouses, well over 100,000 casks, over 230 different types of casks, barrels, all in a 10-minute walk from our blending room, which is a unique opportunity we have, because if you think about it, on Islay, with 9 distilleries, you think there'd be a lot of whiskey aging on Islay. There's not. There's no rules on where you age your Islay whiskey. To call it an Islay whiskey, just needs to be distilled on Islay. That's it, full stop. And if you're going, and if you're taking the ferry, when you go back, go up on the roof deck, have a cigar, Heineken, whatever. It's a good 2-hour trip. It's fun. But look down, you'll see a tanker of raw whiskey, raw distillate, leaving the island. So, we are one of 9 distilleries. We're the only major distillery on the island that ages 100% of our whiskey on the island. Whiskey does not leave the island until it's ready, until it's in the bottle. Yeah, and because we're doing everything on the island as much as possible, now using Islay-grown barley, which we're going to taste in a moment, and using that original equipment without any automation, we're the largest private employer on the island of Islay. You've got 9 distilleries, 200 people working in the industry, half of them, about 100 people work at Bruichladdich. And we're the second smallest in terms of the amount of whiskey we produce. So it gives you an idea of the sort of the opportunity cost, if you will, of the jobs that aren't happening from other distilleries. So a big part of what we wanted to do when we reopened the distillery was to explore flavor, to do things differently, to follow this sort of idea of terroir, sense of place, but to keep things on Islay as much as possible. Now what I poured for everybody is our classic Lottie, our house style, and this is, right off the bat, you're going to notice, an unpeated Islay whiskey. I talked to a lot of people doing this now for 10 years. Will say, is that legal? Can you release an unpeated Islay whiskey? Is it still an Islay whiskey? And they've talked to a lot of marketers. There's a lot of marketers that say an Islay whiskey must be peated. Our opinion is, flavor profile aside, an Islay whiskey is a whiskey that's distilled on Islay, but then also aged on Islay, bottled on Islay using Islay spring water, but made by Islay people and giving back to the community surrounding the distilleries, regardless of flavor profile. So, our whole opinion is that Islay is, it's a place, it's a community, it's not a badge, right? It's not a flavor profile. So this is an unpeated Islay. That being said, we do make a heavily peated, and then, hold my beer, you have the world's most heavily peated. So there's something there for everybody. But starting off with classic Lottie, an unpeated Islay, something that definitely sort of pushes back against what you think of when you think of a heavily, an Islay whiskey. So light, floral, elegant. What's that?
Against for fighting.
Light, floral, elegant, very easy to drink. We nose this yet? I mean, I see some empty glasses already. That's
Yeah, sorry.
Cereal forward, toffee, vanilla caramel is there, but it's more on the back end because it is a refilled cask.
And
Should get some nice kind of summer fruits. Very
super
smooth.
creamy.
Creamy. Yeah. So no chill filtration on this. Anyone not heard of chill filtration before? Can you go into that? Basically removing the oils from the whiskey. If you take a glass of whiskey and you add water to it and it has not been chill filtered, you'll see that haze in there, that cloud, right?
They're killing that whiskey.
I know, but it's for science. Because you'll see though, you'll get this sort of the separation. We call it this band of gold, right? It's all the oils will float to the top. And I can grab a drop of that and really kind of fight to get it to fall off my finger. Because it has viscosity, it has that sort of depth, that sort of that mouthfeel. And that coats the palate. That's what a lot of the malt sugar, the sweetness from the grain is in those oils. But if I go deeper to the bottom, it's all watery. and you spend 10 years drinking non-chill filtered Bruichladdich, you try to go back to an 80% 40 proof spirit, it is like drinking water. But the texture, the real kind of heart of the whiskey and the ability to talk about the quality of the raw ingredients is in those oils. So if you are chill filtering, there's a good chance you're using commodity barley that again is not about the flavor, it is more about the casks and the marketing.
Texture is so much to
Big
whether
part,
it be
big
wine
part
or
of flavor.
yeah, it's amazing.
Can I have a little bit of beer wine?
Click into Classic Lottie, scroll down, and you'll see this flavor map. Below that, reveal your Classic Lottie recipe. This one is 24011.
I love you guys.
And it gives you exact list of everything in there. 83 casks, 5 vintages, 6 barley types, 10 cask types. Roberto del Duero Tempranillo, Oloroso Sherry cask, refilled into American Oak, Cabernet Sauvignon, Côte d'Aron,
Birth
Syrah.
certificate, right?
Everything you want to know about making this at home, feel free. Knock yourself out.
Do you
It's all right there.
Does Westland do the same thing?
Westland does not.
Oh, okay.
No. Not yet.
I always
But you get
wondered.
the idea. And then batch to batch, that list is going to change.
Is there a master blender?
Yes. Yeah,
So
we
a
have
single master blender?
Adam Hannon is our head distiller.
Distiller.
Who does
All the blending.
Yeah, he runs the. He's managing the stills. The guys running the stills, and does all that. It's the same thing. The route to get there is going to change. It's the opposite. This is us pulling from farms on the island. From 1 year's harvest. Yeah. We know what we're starting with, but the whiskey that comes out of that is the experiment. Sort of like a snapshot in time. We might need to pull.
This is just going to be a splash.
Yeah, we might need to pull a bottle.
Is there another one?
There's one more up there. Yeah.
Okay. Then it doesn't have to be such a splash.
So in 2003, we started talking to local farmers saying, hey, look, we want to do an Islay grown barley. As far as we could tell, Islay hadn't been growing barley since before World War I. We had one farm agree to grow for us in 2003. Now there are over 20 that are all growing for Bruichladdich, which allows us to do some really kind of cool single vintage, single estate style whiskeys. This is 8 farms, all within a 10-mile radius around the distillery, 8 years old, 1 year's harvest. You've got a maturation profile on this, about 75% American oak, 25% mix of wine cask, and a little bit of sherry barrel. But the idea being is that the Islay grown barley all has more minerality to it. You know, there's salt in the air, salt in the soil. The casks are actually absorbing salt as well. You know, the crystals will mineralize to a point where they can be absorbed through the casks.
Can you pass me the bottle so I can take a video of it? It's right there. It's right
Some
there.
whiskey's really dark and some not. So like this is very light. Is that because it's not?
It's a combination of age and caramel.
Where's the caramel coming from?
E150 caramel coloring. Yes. If it doesn't say coloring free, we don't use any coloring. Yeah. If it doesn't say coloring free, that's whiskey, Scotch whiskey. That's you can assume.
So when the bourbon law in the United States says straight whiskey, nothing's been added. Okay. Doesn't mean the other stuff does happen.
Me too.
But if it says straight whiskey, you can't add it.
Is that true?
I don't want
I don't
any-
think bourbon can add coloring.
Scotch you can't add
No,
color.
he's saying it's not whiskey. They can't
Unless
add
it's,
color.
if it doesn't say color free on the bottle.
We opened in 2001. The joke was what we paid for was essentially 5,000 barrels of whiskey and a rundown shitty distillery we got for free. Because the majority of what we were paying for was the stock that came with the whiskey, with the distillery. So we set about recasking that. If you know Bruichladdich story, you know we released about 500 whiskeys between 2001 and 2012. It was 1 week we released 19 whiskeys, 1 week in December. Got a little crazy. But that stock that we had, that original 5,000 cask stock, has been dwindling. We have a whiskey called Black Art. Anyone have Black Art before? That is the last of the best of that original stock. But now we're down to less than half of 1% of the original stock. So the Black Art you see out today, Black Art 11, is the last Black Art. There will be no more Black Art. There will be no Black Art 12.
Get it while you can.
That is the last of the last. And what we do have remaining of that is in Bruichladdich 30 year. So this represents the legacy stuff, where Bruichladdich came from. All we're going to taste now is Bruichladdich 18, which this is all whiskey that we distilled when we reopened the distillery in 2001. Now, first, I want you to take a look at the packaging here. You know, a lot of luxury whiskeys come with these big, kind of ridiculous boxes that you might keep on your shelf. Goes right to the trash. You buy another bottle, it goes right to landfill. During the pandemic, we made hand sanitizer like everybody else. Our other project was getting what's called a B Corp certification. Anyone heard of a B Corp before? Heard of a B Corp? You'll find a B Corp that has the B on the back of the bottle of any type of package. B Corp is essentially it's a list of criteria that you as a business elect to hit, volunteer to hit these. That basically say that you're using business of force for good. You're putting people in line with profit and planet. Your hiring practices are ethical. You're trying to reduce your carbon footprint. We became the first single malt Scotch distillery to get B Corp certified. Actually, the first gin distillery to get B Corp certified. And part of that initiative was changing up our packaging. So we eliminated secondary tins. You won't see Port Charlotte in a tin anymore. We changed the bottle for Bruichladdich. We recognize this is a brand new package for this. This bottle uses more recycled glass, considerably less materials, is much lighter. We're able to get 35% more on and off a pallet. We've reduced our carbon footprint by 65% just by changing this bottle. So for us to do a luxury whiskey, we wanted to kind of keep that luxury feel, that packaging, without contributing to waste. So this is the first time it's been done in spirits. You have we had a papier, if you will, is what it's called, 19th century paper company in London create this specifically for us. It's 100% post-consumer grade paper, the same kind of thing you see in Ruinart champagne, and just opens up and sort of hugs the bottle. Great presentation, but if it goes in the landfill, no big deal.
The best thing about that bottle is this.
The glass stopper. I mean, the attention to detail in the relaunch of this and that bottle design. But
There's only one problem with this.
What's
you
that?
open it, and it's gone.
Yeah.
We are four, we open it, it's gone.
Open it and it
Go.
was like
Trouble,
disappears.
trouble.
Evaporates.
I blame it on my dog.
Less than 4
My
hours.
dog must have a.
But these are sort of the yin and the yang, if you will, of the Bruichladdich story. You have Bruichladdich 18 representing where we just recently came from, and the Bruichladdich 30, which is the history, the legacy of the Bruichladdich distillery. Now, what's fun about the 18 is this is a collection of firsts. This has in it the first organic barley we distilled in 2003, as the first Isla barley we distilled, which we just talked about, in 2004. So we've got a little bit of both the organic and the Isla in there. Scottish grown barley. You know, these whiskeys that we produced after 2001 are all traceable grain to glass. Where the farm was, we know everything. 89% American oak on this, personal American oak. 7% Sauterne wine cask.
Ooh.
4% port.
And if I go to your link, that'll tell me all of that.
So Classic Lottie has the recipe online. This we're putting the recipe on as well. Because this is now going to be core. And like Classic Lottie, the recipe is going to change a little bit here and there, year to year, based on what we have.
So you guys import the American oak barrel to Iowa for this?
So when you're making bourbon, you can only use the cask once, which means is that you can't reuse a bourbon barrel. So there's a huge secondary market
Southern.
for American refill bourbon casks. So Scotch whiskey across the board is the biggest consumer or customer, if you will.
And this is
for
also
American oak. So yes, all Scotch.
But it's from the bourbon trade
Yeah, refill bourbon barrels.
versus, I was going to say, why didn't you just do French oak? Because it's got to be a shorter distance.
more expensive.
There is French oak in this,
Okay.
but they all bring different flavor. That's
I know, I
it.
get that.
Yeah.
But if you're using French oak, are you using new French oak versus French oak that's been used in something else?
Sauterne,
French oak is
this
more
is-
expensive
and
than
port.
American
But we
oak.
also do use virgin French oak as well. We're tasting a whiskey that has virgin French in it. Based in New York City, pretty much still calls the shots. So when I started in 2015, it was the year that Jim McEwen retired. Everyone found out Jim tired off of Facebook. We found out that Jim retired off of Facebook. After every-
I found out in Isla because I was fortunate to do the last tasting with him. And he
Wow.
retired the next day, which was pretty.
Mojo's fault.
But one of the stories that I always heard coming from Jim and people that had talked to Jim was that Warehouse 16 was where they stored the best whiskeys. Warehouse 16 was where they stored all the whiskeys going into Black Art. And they call Warehouse 16 the Vatican because of that. So for a decade, the the story I told was that the best whiskeys, the holiest of the holies, was stored in the Vatican Warehouse 16 because obviously that has the holiest cask in there. I was visiting Bruichladdich 2 years ago, and I did like a working day where I spent 3 hours working in the warehouse with the guys there, and I brought it up, Warehouse 16, the Vatican. They had no idea what I was talking about. I said, well, don't you call it the Vatican? Like, yeah, but what does that have to do with black art? It's like, well, that's where the best of the whiskeys are. Like, no, that's where we do the Vatican.
Oh, that accent got you.
They had no idea, and for 10 years I was like, oh, the Vatican, it's the best whiskeys ever. That's where they do the Vatican. So it was a dad joke the whole time.
Do you mind if I get the packaging, please?
I know. Okay.
30 years this year.
$22.99?
Oh, yeah.
Right on the sheet.
That is 30 years in American oak. 30 years in American oak.
Straight from the Vatican.
Straight from the
You want it?
Highland peat, which is what we're pulling from here, has more tree and grass content to it. Lowland peat has more seaweed content to it, which is why lowland peat tends to have more of that iodine sort of element to it. It's also more difficult to work with because it's wet. And it takes longer to dry, and you get less of what's called phenols out of it.
So this is Highland peat?
This is Highland peat.
All of it peat for
Bruichladdich is all Highland peat.
Could
Because the
you-
one thing we
sorry.
don't do on the island is we don't malt. There is one malting facility on Isla, Port Ellen, owned by Diageo.
Could you explain what peat is for people that don't know?
Yeah.
And how do you add the peat and all that?
Sure. So at the Port Ellen malting facility and all the malting facilities, they all kind of go the same way, but we couldn't afford Port Ellen up front. They wanted to be paid up front. They had no interest in holding individual farms separately. They couldn't do that. To most malting facilities, it's barley in, barley out. You give them 200 tons of barley, you get 200 tons of malt back. Might not be the malt that you get, the barley you gave them. It's just 200 for 200. We want to be able to, like I said, trace grain to glass. We want to know where what farms were involved, where that barley came from. So we partnered with Baird's up in the Highlands, and they're pulling from the 200 farms surrounding them, as well as the peat surrounding them as well.
Is that the BERE?
Baird's.
Oh.
Baird's is Baird's.
okay.
Yeah, it's a malting facility.
But I-
Bear is another whiskey we make, but that comes from Orkney. Barley Ash.
Oh, okay.
So, but the peating process, for those who are unfamiliar, essentially, here's the difference between, say, brandy and whiskey, right? Whiskey comes from beer, brandy comes from wine. It's very easy to make wine because you need sugar to make alcohol. You can take a Ziploc bag full of grapes, mash it up, throw it in the corner of your room, and in a week you'll have alcohol. You probably don't want to drink it, but you will have alcohol. I did that in college. Apple cider. That's the way to do it. When you're making whiskey, though, starting with beer, that sugar is not there. It's not easy to ferment. You have to germinate it first. So I remember in grade school you took a bean and a wet paper towel on the windowsill and you let it sprout. Same idea. So you take barley after it's been harvested, you let it soak in room temperature water, and right before it germinates, right before it sprouts, you need to dry it and stop that process. You can dry it with hot air, and you have an unpeated whiskey, or you dry it the old-fashioned way, which is you burn peat beneath it, and it absorbs the carbon acid, absorbs the phenols into the barley as it's drying. Now, all peat is just 10,000 years into becoming any other type of fossil fuel. It's a type of moss that's so dense it doesn't let carbon escape into the atmosphere, so it just traps carbon, and over the years, this gets compressed down and down and down. 10,000 years into the process, you can cut it out, you can dry it, you can burn it like a log. And so for Scotland, where they don't have a whole lot of trees, when the Romans came and cut them down centuries ago, they pull their fuel source from the ground. So historically, peat was used to heat your house, to heat your stills, and to malt your barley. So, Now we're all peat experts.
Now we're drinking.
Bricks.
Have you tried
Peat
heating the
bricks.
peat?
Remember, we're not drinking, we're learning. This is a 40 phenol part per million whiskey, 40 ppm. ppm is like an IBU rating for beer, like a bitterness rating. That is the phenolic content in the malt. Your typical Islay ppm is like 25, 30, 35, 35 for Lagavulin, 30 for Beaumont, 40 for Lefroy, 40 for Port Charlotte. So technically speaking, this is as peat, the same level of peat as Lefroy.
So this is that, or is this the heavy?
This is our heavy peat.
Okay.
So peat burns naturally. You can light it on. You can light it and it burns.
Yeah, once it's been dried out.
Or once it's been dried. Okay.
So everything until this barley one, you're talking about grain to glass, basically, right? Like Isla's, like true Isla, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, what do you mean, true Islay?
Because you're saying that this, you get, well, everything until this,
Yeah.
because you say you bring the peat from Highland.
Oh, so everything
That's
is
what I
malted,
mean.
Everything is malted at Baird's.
Oh, okay, okay,
Right.
okay, okay.
So for classic Lottie, we're pulling
You
from
bring, you
farms
still bring the
surrounding
barley
Baird's.
from up there.
The barley's grown in northern Scotland.
Okay,
Around Baird's. They bring it in, they malt it, they ship it to us.
okay.
The Islay barley, this one here, is all grown on Islay. Then the barley is shipped to the mainland, malted at Baird's, and shipped back to us.
Okay.
So,
So
that's
this is,
expensive, and
so-
that's a big carbon footprint.
oh, I'm sure.
We're
So
working-
this is grain to glass then.
They're all grain to glass because those farms in the Highlands, we also trace those too.
Okay.
So we know those farmers, and it is pulling from about 200 farms total, but in that area is about 70, 80 farms, and those farms are all traced grain to glass. Everything except for this one, we know we can trace back to the farm.
Yeah. Okay.
This we have no idea where the barley came
Yeah,
from.
because it's a blend. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
They toast the barley there, or they dry the barley?
No, we're not
there?
toasting any barley.
No?
It's all pale malt.
Malt,
Westland's
salt,
Westland's
malt,
the one that,
malt.
that roasts the barley. All the malting is done
In the Highlands.
of
The
Baird's.
Highlands. Okay.
But the Islay-grown barley, we're building a malting facility at Bruichladdich.
Okay.
So we're going to be malting all the Islay stuff at Bruichladdich, because right now it's grown on Islay, shipped to the mainland, malted, shipped back, and then shipped back out in a bottle after it's been distilled. We want to eliminate that step. It's expensive. We're not efficient. We're not efficient. But we want to be able to trace it. Everything you think of single malt Scotch. We have tasted 30-year, right? We're finishing with a 5-year. Rockmore's 5 years old. This particular bottle is at 57.9% ABV, so we're at almost 120 proof.
Love it.
And in terms of ppm, this is on the lower side for Rockmore. We have Lefroy at 40, Port Charlotte at 40. This is 108.2 ppm. The highest we've hit is 309 ppm.
What?
So I literally just gave you 3 reasons why this whiskey is absolutely undrinkable. It's too strong, and it's too peaty. But it is about taking these off-the-chart numbers and bringing them to something that is effectively balanced. Running the world's most elite spirit through stills that are made for making whiskey for blends. So the idea for Oxford came from us talking to Baird's, our malting facility in the Highlands. We were asked them, how are you able to get 40.0 phenol parts per million for Port Charlotte? It's a room full of smoke. You know, it's not an exact science. You're able to get 40.0 to the decimal point, ppm. And they said, well, we don't. We get whatever we get. We get like 81.3 or 104.9 or whatever your favorite radio station is. And we get that. And we bring it down to order with unpeated malt to whoever's asking for it. And that was mind-blowing to Jim and the rest of the team there, because they had no idea that they were doing that. That, you know, your peated malt at 40 ppm was actually cut with unpeated malt. So Jim's natural next question was, well, has anyone ever distilled the uncut stuff? And they said, no, you couldn't do it. It'd be undrinkable. Challenge accepted. Send me a batch. That's where Oxford came from. Sort of what if kind of moment. Look at that color. Measured, yeah. High performance liquid chromatology, HPLC.
And that's the amount of smoke that's in there.
That is the amount of phenols.
Phenols.
Yeah,
For
carbon acid.
an hour, for
In the end malted malted whiskey. By taking more time and malting it, you're able to get more phenols in it. Think of it like cold smoked salmon.
Right.
So how?
Think about your brisket, actually. That'll remind you of something like this.
Yes, it will open up. Add a few drops of water too, it'll open up considerably.
So how do you determine, like, what determines the ppms? Because you talked about ppms.
Science. High performance liquid chromatology.
Okay.
Like lasers and shit.
Okay. Science.
Beyond that, I have no idea how it works. But it is HPLC is the standard.
Okay.
Very, very narrow cut. If you're thinking about distillation, running a pot still is like turning on a faucet, right? The first 15 minutes you let it run, you're not going to use that stuff coming out. That's called the heads. And then after that, you're letting it run. That middle part, that's the part that you keep. That's the heart. The last, say, half hour or so, as it's running down to 0% ABV, those are the tails. You don't use that. But those volatile, funky, in-your-face, burning hospital flavors are in the first like 20, 25 minutes of the stills. So at Bruichladdich, we're taking that first cut for Bruichladdich in Port Charlotte, instead of 15 minutes in, about half an hour in. So we cut more of those volatile elements out. Octomore, that first cut's at 45 minutes. So that's the idea, is starting with as much as we can get and then taking that very, very narrow, elegant middle cut. So by starting with all those phenols, the 180, 200, 300, whatever it is, we retain a lot more in that middle cut. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it reads like it's just like this sticker shock of just like, we're just, whatever we want, throwing as much in there as possible, just letting it go. It's actually just starting with more, so you can take a more kind of detailed, nuanced middle cut.
In Chicago we tried a 15-3, which is I think more cherry flavor. It was sweet.
That's the Isla grown barley.
Okay. So the difference between 15-2 and 15-3 is the Isla plus the finish?
Yeah, exactly. 15-3 is always Isla barley grown at Octomore Farm a mile away, and then aged separately, different ppms, it's malted differently, and usually a different cask. This is the same whiskey as 15.1, but 15.1 is 5 years in American oak. This takes a different path in the warehouse. It's 4 years in French, 4 years in American, blended, 1 year in French.
How would compare to your others? Do you mind if I look at the bottle when they're done? And my second question is, do you know what they do with the heads and the tails? Do you know what if they reuse the heads?
Yeah, the heads get redistilled, the tails get pumped out of the ocean.
They don't do anything else with it? They don't make hand like sanitizer?